African Caribbean thought. So this section is going to be looking at or examining a few schools of African Caribbean or Afro-Caribbean thought, some philosophy and some political ideologies, some social movements, to examine their impact on Caribbean development and the Caribbean in general. The first part, and also I have to say, African Caribbean thought, because the Caribbean is made up of a lot of different groups of people. Majority is people of African descent, African people, Afro-Caribbean people. There are also Indian, uh, both, India, and American India, or Amerindian, the indigenous people of the Caribbean. They both make up significant and important parts of the Caribbean. Not every place has such an abundance of those groups, but they are definitely part of the Caribbean. And there's also Chinese, of course. They make up a significant population in the Caribbean, significant social and cultural group. And so there's a lot, and of course there's the Europeans as well, who do make up the Caribbean society and culture, rather whether or not their involvement has always been humane or not. And all these groups do make up the Caribbean, but we're looking at African Caribbean thought mostly because, again, the majority of the people of the Caribbean are of African descent, and because of the prevalence and severity and intensity of the African experience to the Caribbean. So yeah, there's also Indian Caribbean. I don't know if Indian Caribbean thought is covered in this syllabus. I seem to remember mentioning it when I was talking about Caribbean studies when I was doing it. Um, Indo-Caribbean and indigenous perspectives. Yeah, it gets a brief mention later on. But what the syllabus really focuses on is African Caribbean thought. So, part one, Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism is a movement that was started in the 18th century by African people in North America, but it only came into full effect in the 1900s. Pan-Africanism is founded on the belief that Africans were being exploited. Not so much the belief that Africans were being exploited, but the awareness of African exploitation. And the perspective is one which citizens of African descent the perspective is one in which citizens of African descent share a similar history, struggle against a number of threats. And so it's basically, people of African descent in the West unite under the banner of being African, rather than, as is in Africa, they would have the affiliation of being Zulu or Xhosa or Igbo or Santi or Amhara or Oromia. You know, in Africa, the what it means to be African is to be a part of your particular group, a part of your particular family or tribe or nation state. But partially because, well, not mostly, I'd say, because of the systematic removal of African culture and heritage and history from African people and people of African descent who were brought to the West, North America and the Caribbean. Um, it makes sense that their African identity would then become different. It would not be so much of an inherited identity. There is part of it that is inherited, passed down, but a lot of it is reclaimed. And so it's cultural um, renewal rather than cultural retention, largely. And that is something that is likely to come up on your multiple choice about cultural renewal and cultural retention, um, and the distinction between those two using various examples. But yeah, because of the aspect of renewal inherent in Western Pan-Africanism. It's or Western identity of African people identifying with Africa. It's certainly different from the experience of being African in Africa. There is African Pan-Africanism, but the Pan-Africanism we're looking at in this syllabus is North American and Caribbean Pan-Africanism, or Western Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism as it exists in the diaspora. Few key points. Colonization of Africa, coupled with the oppressive nature of the plantations and the inequality of blacks in the society, led to the formation of the Pan-African movement. So that's it. Um, People were aware both of the plight of Africans where they were, their own plight, and the plight of the people in Africa themselves, which is different, but still a plight. And so that led to a feeling for a need for solidarity. Right. The major founders of the Pan-African movement included Henry Sylvester Williams, George Padmore, William or W.E.B. Dubois, um, is William E.B. Dubois, but you may just know him as W.E.B. Dubois. Let's see, we have Edward Blyden. We also have, of course, Marcus Garvey. And like I said, a lot of these names are not particularly recognizable in the Caribbean because, like I said, the movement started in North America and kind of bled down into the Caribbean, or was not that there wasn't, African identity movements or African cultural renewal movements in the Caribbean. There wasn't a sense of Pan Africanism in the Caribbean developing independently of the one in North America, but the one that we're talking about developed in North America. And the one that exists today in the Caribbean is largely connected to the one that developed in North America. But there is, of course, other African Caribbean thought that is more indigenously Caribbean that we'll get to later on. Uh, right. And its aim is to promote Black consciousness and unity among Blacks globally and to promote pride in Black culture. So again, that's it. It's a Black culture, not the culture of the Zulu or the Xhosa or the Asante or the Igbo or the Amhara or the Oromia. Just Black culture, African culture, because Pan-Africanism in the West is formed by a people who are so separated from what it would have been to be an African um, without the experiences of slavery and colonialism and the oppression of Africa and Africans at home and abroad. And so they have to reconstruct African identity, African culture, connection to Africa. That has to be, at least in the early stages, largely reconstructed. Um, and so it is interesting to look at the differences between how African people outside of Africa view Africa and how African people in Africa view Africa because of things like Pan-Africanism, because of even the very influence of um, European colonialism, the ascribed traits that they gave to African people, um, the misconceptions that even today people in the West, and especially Black people in the West, still have about Africa and Africans back then and now. Um, it's very interesting. We don't have a lot of time to go very deep into it, but it's just for me the most interesting part of Pan Africanism is to think about the way in which a people so systematically separated from what it means to be African organically and naturalistically, seeking for an identity and a connection to family, and a peoplehood, being someone, and knowing who that is, are forced to reconstitute such from honestly having very, very little. And the decisions that are made in that process and what direction that goes. That one has always been quite interesting to me. The next part, we looked at Pan Africanism, looking at negritude. So negritude is concerned with black consciousness and black pride. It's a movement, um, negritude, negritude. And it's a philosophical and literary movement developed largely by black French poets and writers. You probably guessed that negritude is French. It, um, it's from the French word nègre, which means black or negro, referring to the people, not the color. The color is noir. The people or the race is nègre, which meant black or negro in France. So negritude is a European approach to what it means to be an African. And if you look at the early history of Pan Africanism or African thought in the diaspora in general, you'll see a lot of this where there were some people who thought, and especially those of the Negritude movement, those who came out of France, those who came out of actual continental Europe, um, whose idea of starting an African movement or a movement of black consciousness was to conform as much to what was acceptable to Europeans as possible. Um, and so it being a movement of poetry and writing and art, um, self-expression, all these things that are valued highly by Europe, was not just about artistic self-expression for black people in Europe, in this case particularly France, but was about, you know, white people, Europeans, those of high class, those of high status. You have poetry and writing and philosophy and thought and all of these things that make up your culture and your not just your culture, but the kind of culture, the definition of culture that you have and that you consider as superior or supreme. We have all of that too. And it's basically just not copying Europeans, but emulating and being acceptable and accessible to Europeans. And that was valued in the negritude movement and generally in early African thought in the diaspora. Uh, right, so the movement was started by three black students who met in Paris. Aimé Césaire, Léon Damas, that's Damas, Léon Damas, and Leopold Sangler. That's, let me just make sure I've spelled that name right. Leopold, oh, Songher. Okay, so Songher. That is Senghor. I may not be pronouncing it right, but Leopold Songhor or Senghor, Senghor. So those are the people responsible for starting the movement. Um, the Negritude movement was also influenced by the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s. The Harlem Renaissance is another, not so much like what we're looking at here, an instance or movement of African Caribbean thought, but more a manifestation of African Caribbean identity and African Caribbean society. Um, the Harlem Renaissance is a very interesting period in US history, and it's definitely worth looking into. Um, if this kind of thing interests you, if the identity of Africans outside of Africa and in the diaspora and its development and its history, if that interests you, then Harlem Renaissance is definitely one of the places where you can see what happens when a bunch of black people are allowed to be in the same place and as far out from under the thumb of white oppression as you could be in um, 20th century America as black people. You know, it wasn't perfect, but it shows what happened when they had the opportunity. Um, so yeah, the ideas of negritude and the philosophy behind negritude influenced the Harlem Renaissance, and the Harlem Renaissance in turn fed back into negritude, the negritude movement. It promotes black consciousness and pride among African people. And again, don't have much time, but yeah. And so examining the negritude movement in the case of this syllabus isn't really so much looking at what the movement is, but just looking at its origins and the significance of the origins of the movement in the Caribbean and how that kind of thing happens among African people in the West. And of course, you know, black people in Europe, black people in North America, and black people in the Caribbean were at this stage, you know, not all of them, it wasn't widespread or anything, and it wasn't very accessible, but they were connecting and they were um, getting together and iron sharpening iron, as they say. So you'll find a lot of Caribbean people, you know, like you'll be reading through the names in the history of US Black history or European Black history, and you'll hear a name that sounds Caribbean, and you'll think, huh, because yeah, there are a lot of Black people from the Caribbean going up to the US and Europe for opportunity, for whatever, contributed in quite significant ways to these sorts of movements. Um, One of the earliest examples of that is back in the days of slavery, an abolitionist former slave called Olaudah Equiano, or as his given name was Gustavo Equiano. Again, very interesting figure and worth studying in depth. All right, so that's negritude. The third one, Rastafari. Now we're getting a bit more familiar, a bit more homegrown, looking at more indigenously Caribbean movements of African Caribbean thought. It is pertinent to understand the role and the influence of the Rastafari movement in the Caribbean. Key points. The Rastafari movement influenced the Caribbean region with the doctrines of Pan-Africanism in an attempt to bring all people of African descent together worldwide. The culture of the movement is one of repatriation and comradeship among black people. The movement has had a significant impact on the world by way of its music, belief systems, and clothing. Key tenets of Rastafari. There's a combination of African and Jamaican folk religions. Well, it is a combination of African and Jamaican folk religions. You know, it's a syncretism. Yes, it's a syncretism of Christianity and a sort of Pan-Africanist. Um, I don't want to say myth, but a Pan-Africanist view of the world, a Pan-Africanist telling of events, in the way that there are a lot of, you know, New Age religious movements from the past 200 years that started in the United States of America, or that flourished in the United States of America. Puritanism, Mormonism, um, Seventh-day Adventism, that started out in America and are quite closely connected to, in their history and in their doctrine and in their influence, things that have to do a lot with America and what it meant to be America. Like I've often, it's often been said, I've heard that Mormonism, for example, is American exceptionalism as a religion. Using that context, you could think of Rastafari as African exceptionalism as a religion. Um, but of course, it's different because it's by people of African descent disconnected from and outside of Africa. Um, and of course, they claim for themselves, the Rastafari um, people claim great influence from the teachings and, as they say, prophecy of Marcus Garvey. Um, so the idea is that one day all African people will return to Ethiopia, that African people, black people, are descendants of the Israelites, and they believe that Emperor Haile Selassie I, who is the last emperor of Ethiopia before the Ethiopian government was, well, first taken over by the communists and then became a republican government rather than a monarchy. So in the last days of the Ethiopian monarchy, the last Ethiopian monarch, um, Emperor Haile Selassie, they believe, as you are probably aware, that he is God. And yeah, sorry. So the belief systems are that white people or the white race is the oppressor, and that repatriation is should be a central value of African people in the diaspora and is a central notion of the movement. And so this idea of repatriation, black people going back to Africa, is very prominent in the Rasta movement. It's a big part of Rasta philosophy, repatriation. Uh, oh, right, okay. So I'm just trying to get through all these notes here. So the notes do mention that Emperor Haile Selassie's name means power of the Trinity, power of the Holy Trinity, um, and that of course takes you into Emperor Haile Selassie himself, his life, his religion, his faith, um, his relationship with the Caribbean, with Rasta people, and all of it is in his autobiography. It's a very good read. If you want to read about an African leader, if you want to learn about an African world leader, you read Emperor Haile Selassie's autobiography. I think it's one of the best things that you can do to study what it means to be an African world leader. Because, as I say always, Ethiopia being one of the, well, being the only African nation that was never had the experience of colonialism by the Europeans. Um, Ethiopia is unique and bears unique study. Um, Ethiopia, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which at the time of the monarchy was the established religion of the country in the way that the Church of England is in England, was one of the founding members of the World Council of Churches, the Ethiopian Empire at the time, as it was one of the founding members of first the League of Nations. Emperor Haile Selassie addressed the League of Nations in response to and concerning the rise of fascism in Europe and its reach, specifically how it was impacting himself and his people in Ethiopia. And he warned them that, if they did not stop Italy and stop fascism where it was in its tracks, that, Ethiopia would not be the last to suffer. And then, World War II happened. So, yeah, Emperor Selassie is interesting to study. It's not exactly related to this syllabus, only tangentially, but yeah, I think it's quite valuable for anyone who's interested in um, what it means to be African and to be African in a global context. Okay. Right. There's a ritual of discussing ideas while smoking the sacred herb of marijuana or cannabis. Um, So discussing ideas, particularly from the Bible and using passages from the Bible known as reasoning and the smoking of cannabis being sacred in Rastafari. It also promotes the eating of vegetables which are strictly organic. It promotes eating as natural a diet as possible, as unprocessed a diet as possible, and not eating animal products as much as possible. This philosophy is called Eitel. A lot of these are familiar, of course, to you, but just have to get through all the notes on Rastafari and the syllabus. Um, right. Impact of Rastafari on Caribbean development. Um, so the culture of Rastafari has been embraced on an international level to an extent, because of course there is still a lot of discrimination against Rastafari people. There is the, for example, Rastas in their hair is still quite an issue, um, and of course cannabis being illegal and criminalized in some places has a big impact on the ability of Rastas to be Rastas. And there's also a lot of other ideas that Rastas tend to have that clash with um, authority. And actually, authority itself is quite a tricky topic, a touchy subject for Rastafari. Philosophically, Rastafari is a response, a lashing out against European authority, and as a result, authority in general. Um, it doesn't explicitly say that, of course, because they still have to have some sort of authority, but there's a certain kind of authority or a certain affiliation of authority. Authority that has too much money, authority that has too much power, authority that asserts itself too much, Rastas do not like. And so there is sort of a natural rebellion and anti-authoritarianism in the movement itself, embedded in it. Right, so reggae music through Bob Marley spread the doctrines of Rastafari. Initially, of course, his baptism in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church did change that, and there is, oh boy, Bob Marley's legacy is another quite complicated subject, and that takes a lot to go into. Um, Rastafari has been used as a marketing tool for tourism. The growing of dreadlocks is um, a recognition of the struggle of the ancestors, the connection to one's roots, one's naturalism, um, and of course there's a dress code, not like an official dress code or anything, but this is how they tend to dress, of wearing sandals, wearing green, gold, red, and black. And there is a strong association, I would say a one-way association between Rastafari and Ethiopia as a nation, as a historical, political entity, and as a concept in general. So if you see, for example, the Lion of Judah, which is the um, previous flag of Ethiopia, um, before it was a republic, the Lion of Judah, when you see that being flown, it's usually being flown by Rastas. Um, the green, gold, and red colors that are the colors of Ethiopia's national flag are commonly associated with Rastas. Right, lost track of time again. But we're back. Okay, so I talked about, yeah, the association, at least aesthetically, and in one direction, with Ethiopia. Uh, what else? There's one more point that I wanted to make about. Oh yes. So again, this one of these central notions, this repatriation idea. Um, the Rastas like to claim. Well, Emperor Haile Selassie said that he has a plot of land in Ethiopia for us, meaning African people in the Caribbean and in the West, in Shashamani. That's the region in Ethiopia where that was like given and preserved for people of African descent in the diaspora if they wish to, come home to Ethiopia. Then this is where you can be. This is where you can live. Shashamani is here for you to be, as you say, repatriated. And it tends to leave them with a sense of disconnection from the identity of being an African in the diaspora, and they cling to the idea of being just an African person. Of course, the ways in which they are African will be different, very different from the ways that African people are African on the continent, because again, it's a reconstruction of African identity, African culture, African connection, all of it, from very, very little foundation. And there's also, of course, a rejection in a lot of, not just in Rastafari, but in a lot of diaspora African movements of what it means to actually be African to African people on the continent, because they're quite different from the ways in which African people in the diaspora have sort of attempted to reconstitute blackness. So blackness and Africanness, while referring to the same thing, are themselves different constructs, if that makes any sense. I think that's all of African Caribbean. Yes, it is. So any questions on Afro Caribbean thought before we move on? All right. In that case, next up, contribution of sports. So we're moving on to, again, different factors in their contribution to Caribbean development, Caribbean society, and Caribbean culture. So we're first looking at sports. Sports contribute to the development of the Caribbean through the social and economic influences that they facilitate. Sporting activities in the region include mostly cricket and track and field. There's also some others, but it's mostly cricket and track and field. There's also netball, football, and various other sports with much smaller communities. Caribbean athletes have gained international recognition by winning competitions and setting and breaking records. You know a few. Fastest man to run 100 meters, Usain Bolt, as well as many others, not just from Jamaica but from the Caribbean in general. Shelly Ann Fraser Price. More recently, we have quite a few young ones who are on the world stage making a name. And sport contributes to the region's development through income generated through tourism, sports tourism, and social cohesion. So, sports unites the Caribbean people in ways that other things do not. Um, so, when Caribbean people want to play, for example, Test cricket, Test matches generally in sports are a nation versus a nation or a national side versus a national side. When Caribbean people want to play Test cricket, it's the West Indies versus England, or the West Indies versus India, or Pakistan, or Australia. The West Indies is the side that enters the World Cup, not any nation, but the West Indies, the Caribbean as a whole. And so Caribbean people tend to rally behind, or rally round, as the song goes, the West Indies. Um, and so sports contribute to social cohesion, but also sports tourism. People who are interested in sports, people who are interested in cricket, for example, may go to Barbados to see the home of the greatest cricketer in world history. Um, People who are interested in track and field may go to Jamaica to see the home of Bolt and many others of his people who have achieved similar greatness, etc. Sports also contribute to human development in the Caribbean through education, health, discipline, and morale. Participating in sporting activities tends to provide educational opportunities for students who may not do well academically. That's not unique to the Caribbean, but of course, the way in which it exists in the Caribbean is unique because the academic opportunities provided by sports for Caribbean students who may not be doing so well academically are not local but international. So you do well in a particular sport, you get an athletic scholarship to an overseas university. Um, if you are attending the University of the West Indies, you don't need a sports scholarship or an athletic scholarship to be good in athletics. And it certainly isn't a path that you take if you're looking to become a professional athlete, except maybe if you're looking to become a professional cricketer. Because on a sociocultural level, cricket is really the only sport, well, cricket and track and field, but um, monetization of track and field and cricket are quite different. But I would say largely it's cricket that is the sport that has the most support for professionalism in the Caribbean. Most sports in the Caribbean exist entirely in a state of amateurism. Sports scholarships may be provided for talented athletes to go to school or also to receive training. Sports promotes a healthy lifestyle through proper diet and exercise. Athletes can also become role models since they tend to have many supporters, especially among children and young adults. If you've ever had an athlete from your school who, is breaking records and going on to do great things and represent not just the school on a national level, but the nation on an international level, and do quite well in that, you'll observe for yourself the publicity and popularity that those athletes will get among especially students. Uh, and sports promotes discipline and boosts morale when individuals are a part of a team or when they receive rewards for hard work and education. So there's these social aspects of sports. Um, my area of expertise is rugby, so I can talk about rugby. In Jamaica, um, the Jamaica Rugby Union is, well, the way that they build their brand or their identity is as rugby against violence, because we know the issues of violence and gang culture um, proliferating in Jamaica. The Jamaica Rugby Union is using its sport as an opportunity for young boys to, rather than being on the streets and being sucked into a life of crime and drugs and violence and general, lawlessness, unproductivity, or social deviance, to get them to be productive, disciplined, be in a positive community, especially with positive male role models, which is something that is lacking in a lot of young Caribbean men's lives, especially those of lower socioeconomic status. And so that is sports as a social entity and a social force, and what it can do for children. It's a small example, of course, because a quite European, quite posh sport like rugby in the Caribbean, while it has its history, it's generally quite small. And again, it's pretty much just cricket when you look at team sports that has embedded itself in the culture enough that, if you want to talk about becoming a professional athlete playing sports domestically in the Caribbean, it's cricket or nothing else. I think that's all in sports. Yeah, okay. We're very quickly going to look at discrimination and then move on to social inequality and their impact on Caribbean development. So, discrimination. We've talked about it a lot because it's inevitable when you're talking about Caribbean history. and the Caribbean, you will be talking about discrimination. The history of the Caribbean is the history of exploitation of people's labor, and the people whose labor is exploited are a particular kind of people. So, there is the view in society that the police may stereotype or label certain individuals as criminals based on a number of factors such as race, religion, and even location. And a lot of religions, especially Caribbean religions, have actually been criminalized or stigmatized, like flat out criminalized in some cases. There's spiritual Baptists being criminalized. There's the Orisha or Shango being criminalized in some cases. There's the long history of the spiritual Baptists and their fight against persecution of their religion specifically. And of course, there is the plight of how Rasta people are treated and discriminated against. Um, okay, a few key terms here. Prejudice and stereotype you're familiar with. A stereotype is um, assigning or ascribing a quality or a group of qualities to a person because of their membership in a particular group or their belonging to a particular demographic. And it's important to distinguish between demographics and communities. And that's one of the things that I think is important in the discrimination topic. Because a lot of people like to talk about, for example, the black community. But it's not necessarily fair to call, depending on the scale that you're talking about, the range that you're talking about, it's not necessarily fair to call black people the black community, black being more a demographic than a community. A community is people who are together in culture and practice and belief in some social endeavor. So, like a sporting community or an agricultural community, you might say. You can say the farming community, yes, but a demographic is just people who have a trait or a quality that connects them together. It's not a choice that they make to be a part of a particular community. It's just a demographic label. So I don't like to use the phrase the black community because it does the thing that Europeans have always done, which is to put black people all into one box. And it's the very same thing that leads to black people in the Caribbean and in the West in general having so little connection to, so little naturalistic, organic connection to Africa and having to reconstitute African identity and blackness from very little, if not nothing. So, yeah, it's important to distinguish between community and demographic in your writing of your essays. There's also a word here. It's a fun. Oh, prejudice, of course, prejudice, before and judge. Prejudice just means to judge someone, to ascribe a behavior or a quality to someone before being aware of their actions or what they are or who they are, like assuming something about someone, again, based on what you stereotype them as and based on a demographic or a group that they are a part of. And there's a word here, pigmentocracy. 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 And pigmentocracy is an extension of colorism. It's a European system for divide and conquering black people in the Caribbean, or people of African descent, I should say, because to say black would, start up a whole thing in a pigmentocracy. And it has to do, as I've talked about before, there are lots of terms that existed in slave society, in the slave times, to describe various combinations of black with other races. And because of the idea of purity and impurity, perfection and imperfection, and race mixing, and the stigma and all the ideas around that, what you were, not like if you were French or Italian or Scottish or Welsh or Igbo or Asante or Yoruba, but what you were, as in, are you black? Are you white? How black are you? How white are you? Are you some Indian? Do you have some Indian in you? Do you have some indigenous in you? That race politics and heritage politics or DNA politics, you might call it, was a big part of the European oppression of African people. And so pigmentocracy, an extension of colorism. So whenever you hear that suffix ocracy, ocracy has to do with rule. And so pigmentocracy has to do with a system of rule or hierarchy or authority that is based on not your race, but your actual color, the pigment of your skin. And so, for example, we've heard about the terms mulatto, quartoon, quintoon, octoroon for different mixes of black and white. Like if you have one white parent, one black parent, you're a mulatto. If you have one white grandparent and three African or black grandparents, you'd be a quartoon, I think. If you have one white great grandparent, you'd be, I think, an octoroon. I'm not entirely sure of all the specifics of the terms. They are quite ridiculous, but they are a part of Caribbean history and they have an impact. So, yeah, I guess we're stuck with that. But pigmentocracy has to do with the superiority and inferiority of people based on the shade of their skin. How light are you? How dark are you? And again, it has to do with the notions of purity and impurity being ascribed to particular races. So, President Barack Obama, as an example, is the first black president of the United States of America. His father is Kenyan. His mother is, I believe, of Irish or Scottish descent. But his father is black, you might say fully black, and his mother is white, fully white. You could say, again. I don't know his family tree, his genetic history, but if you look at his father is a black man. If you look at his mother is a white woman. And so, in theory, he should have equal claim to being white and being black, because if he is a black man because his father is a black man, then he should also be able to be a white man because his mother is a white woman. Um, However, no one will ever call President Barack Obama a white man, even though he is as much white as he is black, because the idea is that white is pure, the white race is pure, and the black race is impure, and black creates an imperfection in the whiteness. And so, the you've probably heard of the one drop rule, which is that if you have one drop of black blood in you, you are black. It has to do with the idea of purity and impurity being associated with particular races. If you are a white person, you're a white person. And if both of your parents are white people, you are white people. But if at any point in your family tree, one of the people who is responsible for producing you is not a white person, then you're no longer white. People may not call you black, depending on where you are, what context you're in, and who you're identifying with. People may not call you black, but you can be called black. And a lot of people who are of quite thoroughly mixed European and African heritage, and if you look at them, you clearly see in their physical features. This person is a thorough mix of black and white, European and African. And yet, those people, not all of them will see themselves as black, um, but but they can identify themselves as black. They can identify with black people, and that won't be rejected. And it would be impossible for them to call themselves white. No one would take them seriously if they called themselves white. Just like no one would take you seriously if you said that Barack Obama is a white man, even though, again, he is as much white as he is black. Because if he is black because his father is a black man, he should also be able to be white because his mother is a white woman, and yet he is not. Because of pigmentocracy, because of purity and impurity being associated with white and black, respectively, because of the one drop rule, and because of the European ideas and conceptions around race mixing and race and miscegenation and all of those things. Discrimination stems from prejudice or prejudicial feelings toward an individual or group of people. It refers to either positive or negative actions taken against others. Discrimination is not necessarily, you know, it's not like you're black, so I'm going to treat you worse. Maybe if you see a white person on the bus and you treat them more deferentially, you give up, you're more willing to give up your seat for a white man that walks under the bus than a black man, something like that. Still discrimination. And it may occur in the form of race, class, gender, age, ethnicity, sexual orientation. The syllabus gives a few examples, but anything that you could be a part of, you can be discriminated against for. Discriminatory, another key term that the syllabus wants you to know is ageism, which refers to discriminatory practices against older persons, and I'm sure you're well aware of that, because again, this is Caribbean studies. It's your life, your Caribbean experience. You live it every day. You see it all around you. All I'm doing is giving you fancy words to talk about it. And so there are various forms that discrimination takes. Social activities, healthcare, media stereotypes, employment, and jokes or comedy. Um, and a lot of people tend to hide behind, or a lot of discrimination tends to hide behind comedy, tends to hide behind jokes. And people have this kind of sacrosanct area in social discourse for comedy, where they say, you're allowed to make jokes about certain things. Like, you can't do this and this and this, but in comedy, you should be allowed to make a joke about it. And so, through the disguise of, and there is, of course, um, legitimate place for comedy to be able to do things that you wouldn't do in other forms of social discourse or other forms of social interaction. But at the same time, there's also a lot of discrimination hides behind what, if you ask people, they would say are jokes. A contemporary example, quite recently, and social media, one of the good things about social media is that you can see a lot of these practices and study them for yourselves. You have a lot of access to wide samples of sociological data. Is if you see, for example, on Instagram, um, an example of a woman or girl doing something that is not socially acceptable, or a certain kind of people, certain kind of men, I should say, do not approve of, in the comments, you see um, the word women and the emoji of a cup of coffee. The origins of the meme are one thing entirely, but the common and general usage of that meme to basically ascribe any negative trait that you can to women and ascribe any negative thing that you perceive about a woman to her being a woman is one of those places in which discrimination hides in the form of a joke. Because if you ask anybody that posts that comment, that meme, women coffee cup emoji, they'll say it's a joke. Not all of them. Some of them are quite open about it, and they have been given the opportunity actually through the um, memification. The mimetic nature of this particular expression of misogyny or sexism or whatever you want to call it. They've been given the opportunity to be more publicly, more discriminatory towards women, and so being given that, they see it as empowerment, and they take it, and they're being strengthened numbers and all that. They are likely to become more emboldened in their disrespect or negative feelings, negative expression concerning women. But a lot of people will simply say, it's a joke, it's a meme. I'm participating in a meme or a joke or a social thing. It's a joke. And so the discrimination is perpetuated, and people are socialized into such discriminatory practices under the guise of jokes. That's a bit of a tangent, but discrimination is an important topic, and it's not just the discrimination of race and class. and gender as we see in it in Caribbean history, but the contemporary experiences of discrimination and why it's important to study those just as carefully. Okay, we've gone a little bit over our time, but that will be our class for today. Stop the